Help support Name Explain by liking this video, leaving a comment and subscribing to the channel. Most nations are broken up into smaller areas. These smaller areas are known as administrative divisions / subnational entities / country subdivisions, plus many other names, but I personally like country subdivision the most, so let's stick with that. There are many reasons why countries get split up in these ways, though the main reason is for regulating and governing. It's kind of hard to have one person in charge of an entire huge landmass, so it's easy to split up into regions to have local governments that feed into one bigger government. However, these subdivisions can also foster their own image and cultural identity. Sometimes these subdivisions want to become nations of their own because they feel so different to the nations they are a part of. And these subdivisions of course have names, in two ways. Each country has a name for what they call their subdivision, and the subdivisions have unique names unto themselves. The best example of this has to be the USA. As a nation, the USA is a series of states that are united, as the name gives away. So from this we can gather what their subdivisions are called, states. The USA is made out of 50 of these subdivision states, and all 50 of these states have their own unique names like Texas, Kansas, Hawaii, and so on. And yes, one day I will explain these state names, but only when we hit our goal of $1,000 a month on Patreon. So if you want to see that video, consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Even just $1 a month seriously helps out in an amazing way. Patreon plug aside, the USA isn't the only nation to call its subdivision states. Just below the USA is Mexico, which is split into 32 states. Brazil is too made up of states, and Germany over in Europe has states too. Other subdivision names include county, used across the United Kingdom, Ireland and Liberia, province used in the likes of Bulgaria, Pakistan and Canada, region used in Chad, Belgium and Morocco, parish used in Jamaica and Andorra, and even oblast used in the likes of Russia and Ukraine, just to name a few examples. And yes, these different names for different subdivisions do actually mean kind of different things in the way they are governed and such, but that's way out the realm of discussion for today's video, perhaps a different time. As we saw, a lot of these subdivision names are used by multiple countries, like how nations as different as Jamaica and Andorra can both have parishes, though some are a tad more unique to their nations, such as the name for the subdivisions of Japan. Japan have always had an image of doing things in their own unique way, and this image dates back to an era in Japan's history called Sakoku. This period lasted from 1639 to 1853, and during this time, Japan had an incredibly strict foreign policy, meaning no one could enter or leave the nation. Because of this, Japan's unique identity blossomed, and many quintessential Japanese things like kabuki theatre, tea ceremonies and bonsai trees are born from this time period. While in the past we've talked about the islands and regions of Japan, these islands and regions are split into subdivisions, and these subdivisions are called prefectures. There's two things I find really interesting about Japan's subdivisions being called prefectures. One being that it's a rather unique name to Japan, although yes, other nations did have prefectures like France, Greece, the Central African Republic and Guinea. However, it seems that prefecture is a term most linked with Japan today. And two being that this really isn't a very Japanese name at all. As I said, Japan is a nation that very much did things their own way, and while this seems to be the case most of the time, in no way did prefecture originate from Japan. Prefectures originated in ancient Rome, where emperors would delegate areas of land to be controlled by a specific person. These specific people were called prefect, which was a rank in Rome but is now more commonly seen as a name for kids given a grain of power and a fancy badge in schools. In Latin, prefectures were called PRAEFECTURA, so the name prefecture obviously comes from prefect and that word forming element added to the end of it. So where did prefects come from? Well, that's obviously Latin too, and it comes from the Latin pre, meaning front / before, where we got the modern prefix from, and the Latin face, meaning to make / do, as prefects were placed in front of other people to make decisions and do the work of the emperor. So this name makes a lot of sense when you look into its etymology. So how did this subdivision name that originated in ancient Rome end up being applied to the subdivisions of an island nation all the way over in East Asia? Well, here's the next big twist. They kind of are and aren't called prefectures. In English, we call the subdivisions of Japan prefectures. However, in Japanese, they're called Todofuken. There's literally no way I can say that without it sounding rude, so let's just carry on. This name's actually a compound noun of sorts. Japan is made up of 47 prefectures, and these 47 are split into 4 different categories. One is a metropolis prefecture, which in Japanese is called a to. One is a circuit / territory prefecture, which in Japanese is called a do. 2 are urban prefectures, which in Japanese are called fu, and the other 44 23 are just standard prefectures, which in Japanese are called ken. So if we take all these short Japanese names for types of prefectures and put them together, we get Todofuken, which is where the name comes from. So they're called this in Japanese, but prefectures in English. Why is this the case? Why was prefecture chosen to be their English name as opposed to something more commonplace like state or region or province? Well, this is because the Japanese at Todofuken were heavily inspired by the prefectures of Europe, and there's a pretty interesting story as to how this all came about. It all begins around the end of the Tokugawa shogunate. This shogunate was the central power that united feuding factions in Japan. This shogunate lasted from 1603 all the way up until 1868, so well over 200 years. It was during this shogunate's rule that the aforementioned Sakoku period of isolation took place, lasting from 1639 till 1853. Because of all this, Japan had little to do with other countries, and other countries had little to do with Japan. So foreign nations didn't know a whole lot about Japan, or how it was governed. This is how the Tokugawa shogunate liked things. However, as we mentioned, the rule came to an end in 1853, and in its place came the Meiji Restoration. This is when Japan came back under the rule of an emperor as opposed to a shogunate after 200 plus years, with this emperor being Emperor Meiji. However, he wanted Japan to be more than just under a monarchy. He wanted Japan to become more integrated into the increasingly more intertwined world, and his restoration saw the country become more modernized and westernized. One thing in particular the Meiji Restoration wanted to change was the previous subdivisions of Japan that the Tokugawa shogunate had put in place. They wanted their country, subdivisions included, to be more in line with other nations on the planet. So to find out how other countries got things done, Japanese officials were sent to Europe and the Americas to see how things like education, international relations, business, industry and government were being handled in these parts of the world. And of course, something else these Japanese officials would have studied is how and why nations put their land into subdivisions. One subdivision they found were the states of the USA. However, these states didn't fit what they wanted. This is because the states of the USA have a degree of autonomy, voted in leaders, and separated church and state. This drastically opposed the Meiji regime, which was one of divine rule, meaning that the monarch was put there by God and no earthly being could deny it. And they wanted their subdivisions to have minimal autonomy, so it's understandable to see why they wouldn't be too fond of things like voting and subdivision autonomy. What the Meiji regime and the Japanese officials did like, however, were the subdivisions of France, which at the time were called PREFECTURA. These subdivisions that France used very much fit with the ideals that Japan had for their own subdivisions, as they were subdivisions with a leader chosen by the emperor and not elected by the people, and they were also set up by Napoleon. Napoleon was of course an emperor himself, and to the Japanese at this time, he was seen as something of a role model because he expanded and modernized France, something Emperor Meiji wanted to do with Japan. Though as Japan started to interact with more and more nations, another issue started to arise: language. The languages of the West, used across Europe and America, at the time had been interacting with one another for so long they could understand and translate one another, and on top of this, a pool of shared words had started to form across these languages that could be used when discussing international affairs. As Japan were late to the party, they didn't have this fortune. They needed to borrow words so they could shape their image in the West. However, this could be seen as something of a positive, as they were pretty much unheard of. They could shape their own image and decide for themselves what words would apply to them. So Japan got to work on finding words that the West could use for them, and for their subdivisions they of course chose prefectures. There was a few reasons to why this name was chosen. First off, because they adored Napoleon. As I mentioned, Emperor Napoleon was seen by the Japanese as an architect for modernizing and expanding a nation, which is what Meiji wanted for Japan, and Napoleon applied the ancient Roman term prefecture to his subdivisions. So if Japan wanted to emulate Napoleon as much as possible, then borrowing his subdivision name was a pretty good place to start. Secondly, even before the Meiji Restoration and the Tokugawa shogunate, the word prefecture had already been established in Japan. It was the word used by Portuguese explorers in the 16th century who visited Japan. When these explorers came to Japan in this time, they used the Portuguese word for prefectures, PREFECTURA, for the fiefdoms they found across Japan, with a fiefdom being an area over which someone exercises control, as or in the manner of a feudal lord. So many in the West would already believe there to be prefectures of sort in Japan, and when the Japanese travelled in the West, they would have seen this term already somewhat applied to their subdivisions. Thirdly, the term prefecture was already in the West's aforementioned pool of words for international affairs, meaning Japan could more easily fit into these already established relationships between nations. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the concept of a prefecture as a subdivision as opposed to a state or territory much better fit what Japan had in mind. Prefecture as a name strongly implies that it's a small part of a larger area ruled by an emperor. It is also implied that the leaders aren't voted in but chosen, and it carries little to no connotation of being independent or autonomous in any way, unlike other names such as state and territory. This was also coming at a time when states of the United States started exercising more autonomy and even toyed with becoming independent, something Japan wanted none of its land to do. And so, prefecture was the name given to the nation's subdivisions, and over the years the West hung on to this name while Japan did what Japan does best and created a name much more unique and well Japanese for the areas, Todofukan. So in a bizarre and unexpected series of events, we have the Romans for creating the term, and Napoleon for being such a strong role model to thank for how this weirdly Western name ended up being used in the quintessential East Asian country of Japan. And of course, each of these prefectures of Japan have unique names like Gifu, Shiba, and Hyogo. I guess the next step would be to explain how all 47 of these individual names came about, but in all honesty I'm exhausted from just explaining why they're called prefectures in the first place. Also, Wikipedia has a page titled List of Japanese prefectural name etymologies, and if I made a video on the subject, it would be little more than just me parroting this list, so go check that out for yourselves. Somehow this video ended up with me plugging Wikipedia, because they need more publicity, I guess. The prefectures of Japan were suggested by Ekmo Sakano, and thanks to their suggestion, they will now be honoured as Name Explain's patron saint of the prefectures of Japan. Do you have a good idea for somewhere that's name could be covered in a Name Explain video? If so, then please consider donating on Patreon. Just $1 a month helps keep the channel running and earns you a weekly chance to suggest somewhere to be turned into a video, and you too could be a Name Explain Patreon saint. Thank you to all my patrons who support Name Explain on a monthly basis. Name Explain depends on small monthly donations from fans like you to help keep the channel running. Just the small amount of $2 a month helps in a huge way, grants you patron exclusive Name Explain extras, and gets your name here with all these awesome people. Thank you. Hello all, and thank you so much for reaching the end of the video. Check out another video and subscribe to stay in the loop on all things Name Explain. You can follow myself on Twitter at NameExplainYT. Follow me there and tweet the name Brock at me so I know you came from this message. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and once again, thank you all so much.